Welcome to Mystic Dragon Chronicles, where every tale holds a lesson. Beyond fantasy, lesson that last. Let's step into the story.
Smoke still hung low over the ridge when Daniel Voss walked out to check his fences. The fighting had ended 2 nights ago, somewhere past the tree line, but the wind still carried the smell of burnt grass into Greywater Hold every morning. He pulled his collar up and kept walking. A farmer could not wait for smoke to clear before checking his land. The east fence had held. The north one had not. A section of posts lay snapped and scattered, and beyond them the ground sloped down into what the settlers call the ash fields, a stretch of blackened earth nobody farmed because it sat too close to Scytharn territory. Daniel had never gone past the broken fence before. He went now, because something in the silence past it felt wrong in a way smoke alone could not explain. He found the nest first, or what was left of it. Cracked shells, scorched and split, were scattered across a wide patch of churned dirt. 3 large shapes lay still nearby, scaled bodies broken, wings torn. Adult dragons. Guardians, maybe parents, killed defending something that had not survived anyway. Daniel had heard of Scytharn raids before, clan against clan, territory disputes that had nothing to do with humans. He had never seen the aftermath up close. He almost turned back. Then he heard it, a thin, rattling breath coming from a shape half buried under a fallen wing. Daniel knelt down. The hatchling was small, barely the size of a large dog, its scales a dull gray-green that had not yet hardened. One wing was crushed flat. Its sides rose and fell in short, ragged pulls of air. Its eyes, when they opened, were a pale gold, and they fixed on him with no fear left in them, just exhaustion. He should have left it. Every rule of Greywater Hold said so. Scytharn did not take kindly to humans near their dead, and a half-grown human farmer crouched beside a slaughtered nest was the kind of thing that started wars, not stopped them. Captain Reyes would have told him to walk away and report it. Old Mirren would have told him the same, more gently. Daniel reached out anyway and laid a hand flat near the hatchling's head, not touching, just close enough that it could feel the warmth. The dragon did not flinch. It seemed, if anything, to lean toward it. He went back to his house and returned with water in a cupped tin and a torn strip of cloth. He did not know if dragons drank water the way horses did, or if the wound across its side could be helped by anything he carried. He pressed the cloth to the wound anyway and tilted the tin toward its mouth. Some of the water spilled into the dirt. Some of it went down. The hatchling's breathing did not improve, but it did not worsen either, not for a while. Night came fast on Hollow Reach. Daniel did not go home. He sat in the cold beside the dying nest, the broken bodies of grown dragons around him like fallen statues, and kept his hand near the hatchling's side so it would know it was not alone. He thought of his own family's grave, 3 small markers on a hill outside a settlement that no longer existed, lost in the first year of colonization when nobody understood how unforgiving this world could be. He had buried them with his own hands too, because there had been no one else left to do it. The hatchling's breathing slowed sometime before dawn. Daniel felt the moment it stopped, a stillness under his palm where there had been a faint, struggling rhythm only minutes before. He did not move for a long time after that. When the sun came up gray through the smoke, Daniel started digging. The ground was hard and full of stone, and he had only a hand spade he had carried from the house out of some instinct he could not explain the night before. It took him most of the morning. He laid the hatchling in carefully, the way he would have laid anything that mattered, and covered it slowly, packing the earth down with the flat of his hands. He found stones nearby, some of them shards from the broken shells, and stacked them into a small cairn at the head of the grave. He did not know any Scytharn words. He did not know if dragons even had funeral rites, or if this gesture would mean anything to anyone but himself. He said the only thing he knew how to say, the same words he had said over his own family's graves years before, simple and plain, about rest, and about being sorry it had to end this way. Then he stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and looked down at the small mound of stones against the blackened field. He did not know that he was being watched. High on a rock outcrop above the ash fields, hidden in the smoke haze, Speaker Uvashi of the Ashclan had come to survey the wreckage of a rival's failed raid, expecting to find only ruin and confirmation of human cruelty toward her kind. Instead, she found a lone human, unarmed, kneeling for hours beside a hatchling that was not his own, burying it with care no clan elder had shown some of their own dead in the chaos of war. She did not understand it. She was not sure she was meant to, but she watched until the human turned and walked back toward the broken fence line, and she did not look away from the small stone cairn long after he had gone. The sun climbed higher, burning the last of the smoke from the sky, and the cairn stood alone on the ridge, a small gray shape against the black earth, holding a secret neither side yet understood. Stories grow strange when they pass through enough mouths, and the tale of the man who buried a dragon grew stranger every season. By the time a year had passed, half of Greywater Hold believed Daniel Voss had done it out of guilt for raids he had nothing to do with. The other half thought he had lost his nerve after losing his family and saw ghosts in every dying animal. Almost no one believed he had simply done it because it felt like the right thing to do, because that explanation was too plain to make a good story. Captain Reyes did not care much for any version of the tale. He cared that Skytharn scouts had been seen near the ridge twice since the burial, watching the cairn from a distance and leaving without incident. That was new. Before, the ash fields had been empty of everything but smoke and silence. Now something was paying attention, and Reyes did not like things paying attention to his colony that he could not predict. He brought it up with Daniel directly, standing at the edge of his field one evening while the sun dropped behind the ridge. "You made yourself a marker out there," Reyes said. "People see things. Dragons see things too. You understand that paints a target whether you meant it to or not." Daniel kept working at a fence post, not looking up. "I didn't bury it to send a message." "Doesn't matter what you meant, matters what it means to them." Reyes nodded toward the ridge. "Just be careful is all I'm asking." Daniel did not answer that. He went back to visiting the grave anyway, not often, just enough to clear weeds from around the stones and make sure nothing had disturbed it. He never saw anyone else there. He never knew how wrong that was. Far across the broken land, in the deep stone halls of the Ashclan, Speaker Uvashi told her own version of events to a council that did not want to hear it. She described the human kneeling for hours beside a creature not of his blood, the grave dug by hand, the words spoken over stones that meant nothing to him and everything to them. She argued that a people capable of mercy without witness were not the conquerors the older clans insisted all humans were. Most of the council dismissed her. One elder laughed outright, calling it a trick of grief or a trap not yet sprung. But a few listened, and among the young hatchlings who heard the story secondhand, it took root the way stories do among the very young, simple and bright and impossible to fully argue away. Not everyone wanted it to take root. Warlord Thekra, leader of a rival clan and the one whose raid had destroyed the original nest, heard the tale and felt something colder than anger settle in him. His war was built on a simple truth he repeated to his warriors constantly. Humans and Skytharn could not share this world, not ever, not peacefully. A human burying one of their dead with his own hands undid that truth in a way Thekra found more dangerous than any weapon. He said nothing publicly. He only began watching Greywater Hold more closely than before, and watching Daniel Voss most closely of all. Seasons turned. Daniel's life went on in the plain, repetitive way a farmer's life does, planting and mending and burying nothing new, though he never stopped thinking of the hatchling some quiet nights. He spoke of it once to old Mirren, his neighbor, a woman who had studied alien biology before the colony's funding dried up and left her tending goats instead of laboratories. Mirren listened to the whole story without interrupting, then sat back with an odd look on her face. "There's an old account," she said slowly, "from early contact records, half-translated and mostly dismissed. Some Scytharn hatchlings, if they die in a certain way, honored but unclaimed by their own clan, don't fully die. They go into something the records call the long sleep, a kind of dormancy. The body shuts down completely, buried, sometimes for years, before whatever is left inside finishes growing into something else entirely. Daniel frowned. You're saying it might not be dead. I'm saying almost no living Scytharn has ever seen it happen. It's myth to most of them now, same as it'd be myth to us if a human did something similar. I wouldn't put weight on it. But she said it carefully, the way people say things they do not fully believe themselves, and Daniel noticed. He went back to the ridge more often after that, though he told himself it changed nothing. He still expected only stone and quiet dirt. Years passed in this slow, watchful way. Thekra's raids grew bolder along the contested border, no longer aimed only at rival clans, but edging closer to human land, testing the response of a militia he believed too thin to hold ground. Ray's fortified what he could with what little the colonial authority sent. Uvashi's voice grew stronger among the younger Ashclan, though never strong enough to stop Thekra outright. And on the ridge, beneath a small cairn nobody but one farmer still visited, something in the cold earth had not stopped changing. By the time the 7th year approached, smoke had returned to the horizon more often than not, and Greywater Hold braced itself for a war it had hoped the truce would prevent. Nobody, human or Scytharn, was watching the ground itself closely enough to notice what was happening beneath it. Except, perhaps, the ground was about to make sure they noticed soon enough. 7 years changes a man more than he notices in the moment. Daniel Voss's hands had grown rougher, his shoulders a little more bent from years of fence work and harvests, and a streak of gray had crept into hair that used to be solid brown. Greywater Hold had grown too, more houses, more fields, more people who had never known a time before the uneasy truce with the Scytharn clans, and so trusted it more than they should have. The morning of the 7th anniversary came in cold and clear, no smoke on the horizon for once, though everyone knew that meant little anymore. Daniel walked the same path he always walked, out past the mended fence line and into the ash fields, which had slowly gone from black to a dull, stubborn green over the years as the land healed itself the way land does, indifferent to what happened on top of it. The cairn looked the same as always from a distance. Up close, it did not. The soil around the stones was warm. Not sun-warm, not the kind of heat the morning light could explain, but warm the way a body is warm, faint and steady beneath his palm when he pressed it flat against the ground the way he had years before. Thin strands of pale moss had grown in a perfect ring around the cairn, glowing faintly even in daylight, a color Daniel had never seen on any plant native to Hollow Reach. He sat back on his heels and stared at it for a long while before he finally stood and went to find old Mirren. Mirren examined the moss sample under what equipment she had left from her old research days, mostly improvised, mostly held together with patience more than parts. What she found made her hands go still over the instruments. "This isn't plant matter," she said. "Not entirely. There's organic structure in here closer to shed-scale tissue than anything botanical. Daniel, I think this matches the old accounts. The long sleep. I think whatever's down there isn't finished, but it's getting close to the end of it." Daniel did not know what to say to that. 7 years of telling himself the hatchling was simply gone, that he had done a kind thing for a dying creature and nothing more, sat uneasily against the warm ground he had just knelt over. He was not the only one who noticed the change. Far across the border, Speaker Uvashi felt it in a way harder to explain to anyone who had not grown up among her kind, a pull in the back of her senses that all Scytharn carried toward sites of significant dormancy, faint but unmistakable once it began. She left her council without full explanation and traveled alone to the ridge above Greywater Hold, arriving as the sun began to set. She found Daniel still there, sitting near the cairn, not guarding it exactly, just present, the way he had been 7 years before. Neither of them spoke at first. Uvashi studied him with the same careful, searching look she had given him from a distance years ago, only this time there was no distance left between them. "You still come here," she said finally, her words careful in the human tongue she had spent years quietly learning, mostly for moments like this one she had not expected to need. Daniel looked up, startled but not afraid. "Every year." "Why?" He thought about it longer than the question seemed to need. "Because somebody should remember," he said. "Doesn't matter if anyone else does." Uvashi looked toward the cairn, toward the glowing ring of strange moss, and something in her chest loosened that had been tight for 7 years of arguing a position almost no one wanted to believe. "It remembers too," she said quietly. "I think it is coming back." Word of Uvashi's absence and her destination did not stay hidden long. Warlord Thekra's spies were thorough, and within a day he knew exactly where she had gone and why. He listened to the report with the same cold stillness he had felt 7 years before, when the story of the burial first reached him, except now the danger was no longer just a story. If the long sleep was real, if it was happening here, on land bordering human territory, with a human at its center, it would become exactly the kind of symbol Thekra had spent years working to prevent. Proof that humans and Scytharn could be bound by something other than war. He would not allow that proof to finish growing. He gathered his warriors that same night, faster than caution would normally allow, and gave the order to move on the ridge before dawn. Whatever was breaking the surface there would be destroyed before it could open its eyes, and if the human farmer who had started this stood in the way, that would be his own fault for choosing the wrong side of a war he had no business being part of. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Thekra's raiders were already crossing the border, moving fast and silent toward Greywater Hold's northern edge, toward the ridge, toward the cairn where the warm ground had begun, very slowly, to crack. Daniel felt it before he saw it, a faint tremor under his boots as he stood beside Uvashi at first light, both of them watching the strange moss pulse brighter with every passing minute. Then, in the distance, the alarm bells of Greywater Hold began to ring. The bells did not stop ringing. Captain Reyes was already moving before the third toll, pulling on gear he had hoped not to need again so soon, shouting orders that sent the thin militia of Greywater Hold scrambling toward the northern perimeter. Smoke rose on the horizon within minutes, not from fire yet, but from the dust kicked up by Thekra's raiders crossing open ground at a pace that left no doubt about their intent. Reyes had maybe 40 able defenders against a force he could not yet count, but guessed was larger. He had no time to wonder why Thekra had chosen this border to strike, only time to decide where to hold the line and pray it was enough. On the ridge above the fighting, Daniel felt the ground shudder harder beneath him. Uvashi had gone rigid beside him, eyes fixed on the cairn, on the moss now pooling in steady waves of pale light, on the first thin cracks spreading outward through the warm soil. "We should move," Daniel said, glancing toward the rising dust cloud of Thekra's approach. "No," Uvashi did not look away from the ground. "If we leave now, whatever is down there wakes alone, into chaos, with no one it knows nearby. That may be worse than anything Thekra brings." Daniel had no training for this. He had no weapon worth the name, only the same stubbornness that had kept him kneeling beside a dying hatchling 7 years ago. He stayed. The militia line met the first wave of raiders at the fence break, and the fighting was immediate and ugly, human resolve against Scytharn speed and strength, neither side built to easily overcome the other but both willing to try. Reyes held the center, shouting positions, watching his thin line bend under pressure it was never meant to handle for long. On the ridge, the cracks widened. Steam or smoke or something between the two hissed up from the broken earth, and the moss flared bright enough to cast pale light across Daniel's face even in daylight. The cairn stones themselves trembled, then slid apart as something beneath them pushed upward with slow, deliberate force. What rose from the ground was not the hatchling Daniel remembered. It was larger than any Scytharn Daniel had ever seen described, easily 3 times the size of the broken adults he had found 7 years ago. Its scales, a deep gray-green shot through with pale lines that mirrored, almost exactly, the pattern of stones in the cairn that had covered it. Its wings, still folded tight and slick with the residue of its long dormancy, trembled as it drew its first full breath of open air in 7 years. Its eyes opened, pale gold, unmistakable, the same eyes that had looked at Daniel once in the ash and exhaustion of a dying nest. Yuvashi staggered back a step, awe and disbelief plain on her face even to Daniel's untrained eye. "The long sleep," she breathed. "It is real. It was always real." The great dragon's head turned, slow and uncertain, taking in the unfamiliar shape of its own enormous body, the ridge, the distant smoke of battle. Then its gaze fixed on Daniel, and something in its posture shifted, the wariness easing into a recognition that needed no words, built from a single night 7 years gone when a small, broken creature had felt warmth pressed against its side, and chosen, in whatever way a dying hatchling can choose, to remember it. Daniel did not move. He was not sure his legs would have obeyed him if he tried. "Hey," he said quietly, the only word that seemed to fit. "You made it." The dragon lowered its massive head until it was nearly level with him, close enough that Daniel could feel the heat of its breath, and made no move that could be called threatening. For a moment, on a ridge above a battle neither of them had asked for, there was only stillness between them. It did not last. Word reached Thekra fast, carried by a scout who had seen the rising dragon from a distance and fled to report it rather than risk getting closer. Thekra received the news with a fury that startled even his own captains. A long-sleep survivor, alive, bonded to a human, rising in plain sight of both armies. It was the single worst outcome he could imagine, proof of exactly the bond he had spent 7 years insisting was impossible. "Kill it," he ordered, his voice carrying no room for argument, "before it can stand on its own wings, before anyone else sees what it means." His warriors hesitated, just slightly, just long enough for Thekra to notice and feel his anger sharpen further. None of them had ever been ordered to strike down something the old stories called sacred. But orders were orders, and Thekra's will had ruled this clan through fear for longer than any of them had served him. The raiders broke from the main battle line and turned toward the ridge, toward the newly risen dragon still finding its balance on legs it had never used, and toward the one human standing unarmed beside it. The great dragon felt the shift before it saw it, some instinct from the body it now wore reading the danger long before its mind had finished waking fully into this new shape. It rose to its full height, wings unfurling at last in a wide, trembling arc, and let out a sound that was not quite a roar, more raw than that, the first voice it had ever truly used. Daniel stepped forward instead of back, placing himself, however uselessly, between the dragon and the approaching raiders. "Not again," he said, low and certain, more to himself than to anyone listening. "Not this time." Thekra's warriors closed the distance fast, and the ridge that had held 7 years of quiet now braced for violence it could not avoid. The first raider reached the ridge expecting an easy kill, a newborn creature too unsteady on its feet to defend itself. He found instead a body that, though unfamiliar even to itself, moved with instinct older than memory, a tail sweeping wide enough to send him crashing back down the slope before he came within striking range. The dragon did not fight with skill. It had none yet, no training, no sense of its own new strength beyond what raw nerve and fear taught it in the space of seconds. It fought the way anything fights when threatened in the first moments of its life, wild and overwhelming, and that alone was enough to stagger the first wave of Thekra's warriors. Daniel stayed close to its foreleg, too near the fighting to be safe but unwilling to do anything else. He had no weapon, no training, nothing but the same stubborn refusal to walk away that had brought him here in the first place. When a second raider broke past the dragon's guard and lunged toward what looked like an easy target in the unprotected human standing nearby, Daniel did not run. He threw himself sideways into the dirt, rolling clear by a margin so thin it left him breathless, and scrambled back to his feet only because the dragon's tail came down between him and the raider half a second later, ending the threat before it could try again. Down on the main battlefield, Captain Reyes saw the shape on the ridge and the chaos breaking out around it and made a decision he would have called insane only an hour earlier. "Pull back the western flank," he shouted. "Get eyes on the ridge. Whatever that thing is, it's not what's attacking us. Thekra's raiders are." His militia, exhausted and bleeding but disciplined enough to trust him, shifted their formation, no longer trying to hold an unbroken line against everything Skytharn, but cutting specifically toward the raiders pressing the ridge, leaving any Skytharn not actively attacking them alone for the first time in the colony's history. It was a distinction that mattered more than Reyes fully understood in the moment, and one that Speaker Yuvashi seized the instant she saw it happening. She had already called out to nearby warriors loyal to her standing, young fighters who had grown up hearing the story of the human and the grave told as something more than myth. "This is not a war against the humans," she shouted over the noise of battle, her voice carrying the weight of 7 years of careful argument finally proven true in front of everyone. "This is a war against a warlord who fears what we just witnessed. Defend the one who returned. Defend what was honored." Her words turned the tide on the ridge faster than weapons could have. Warriors who had hesitated to follow Thekra's order from the start now found a reason to refuse it outright, turning instead to drive back their own former allies, clan briefly fracturing along lines of belief rather than blood. Thekra watched his forces falter from a distance, fury rising past anything reason could hold back. If his own warriors would not finish this, he would do it himself. He broke from the rear of his advancing line and charged the ridge directly, faster and far more skilled than any raider who had come before him, cutting toward the still unsteady dragon with the precision of a leader who had survived 100 smaller battles to reach this one. The young dragon, still learning the size and weight of its own new body, was not ready for an opponent like Thekra. The first strike caught it hard across the shoulder, staggering it sideways, wings buckling as it fought to keep its footing on ground still cracked and uneven from its own rising. Daniel saw it happening half a second before it landed, the way Thekra shifted his weight for a second, finishing blow aimed low, exactly where the dragon's unsteady stance left it open. There was no time to think, only to move. He threw himself forward, not toward safety, but directly into the narrow gap between Thekra's strike and the dragon's exposed side, arms raised uselessly in front of him, the same desperate, instinctive act that had once sent him kneeling beside a dying hatchling no one else thought worth saving. The blow that should have ended everything never landed clean. Thekra pulled back at the last possible instant, some old instinct or hesitation breaking his focus just enough, and the strike that connected was a glancing one, enough to throw Daniel hard into the dirt but not enough to kill him outright. It was enough, though, to break whatever control Thekra had left over the dragon's restraint. Pain and fury and something fiercely protective surged through the creature all at once, and it moved with a speed its unfamiliar body should not yet have had, driving Thekra back across the broken ground with a force that sent him sprawling, weapon knocked clear. The momentum of the fight finally, completely turned. Thekra's remaining loyal raiders, seeing their leader thrown down and the rest of the clan now openly against him, broke and scattered rather than press an attack they no longer believed in. Thekra himself, bruised and stripped of the certainty that had carried him through years of war, retreated into the smoke without another word, his claim to leadership shattered as surely as the ground he left behind. Silence settled over the ridge in slow, uneven waves, broken only by the ragged breathing of a battle finally ending. Daniel lay where he had fallen, pain sharp along one side but nothing that felt fatal, and looked up to find the great dragon lowering its head close beside him, eyes searching his face with an urgency that needed no translation. "I'm all right," he managed, voice rough. "Told you, not this time." Around them, both human and Scytharn forces stood still, staring at the unlikely pair on the cracked, glowing ground, none of them entirely sure yet what they had just watched happen, or what it would mean for everything that came after. The days after the battle moved strangely, the way days do after something too large to fully understand happens all at once. Greywater Hold buried its dead, tended its wounded, and tried to make sense of the fact that a dragon now rested on the ridge above their fields, watched over not by guards but by choice, neither prisoner nor stranger. Thekra did not return. Word filtered back over the following weeks that his clan had fractured in his absence, warriors who had refused his final order, refusing his leadership entirely once the dust settled, and that he had fled deeper into contested territory with only a handful of loyalists left to him. Whatever war he had hoped to win on the ridge, he had instead lost the only thing that had ever given him real power, the certainty of his own people. Speaker Uvashi rose in his place among those who had turned against him, her years of careful argument no longer dismissed as naive, but remembered as the only voice that had read the moment correctly. She did not seek to rule so much as to be heard, and for the first time in longer than most living Scytharn could recall, enough of her kind were ready to listen. The dragon itself, still without a name any human could easily say, began to settle into the strange new shape of its life. It could not speak in the early days, not in any language Daniel understood, but it followed him through the field some mornings the way a much smaller animal might, folding its great wings low and patient, watching him work with an attentiveness that felt less like a guard and more like company. Old Mirren, fascinated past the point of caution, spent hours nearby taking notes, calling it the most significant living record of the long sleep anyone had documented in generations. It was Uvashi, weeks later, who finally gave Daniel the word he had been missing. She came to the farm not as an emissary this time, but almost as a visitor, watching the dragon rest near the fence line while Daniel finished his evening work. "Among my people," she said, "one who survives the long sleep, bound by honor rather than blood to the one who saw them through death, is called Rel. It means, roughly, the one remembered." Daniel looked over at the great creature, eyes half closed in the fading light, and the name settled into place easily, like something that had always belonged there. "Rel," he said quietly, and the dragon's head turned at the sound, ears or the closest thing it had to them lifting in clear recognition. Captain Reyes was slower to accept what had happened than most, but even he could not argue with results. Raids along the border had stopped entirely in the weeks since Thekra's fall, and Uvashi had sent word, through Daniel rather than any formal channel, that her clan wished to discuss terms no Scytharn leader had offered humans before. Real terms. A real peace, not the thin, fragile truce Greywater Hold had survived under for years, but something built on more than mutual exhaustion. The colonial authority, when reports of the battle and its aftermath finally reached them, sent representatives within the month, eager to claim credit for a diplomatic breakthrough they had done nothing to create. Reyes met them with the same flat patience he met everything, and made it clear, more bluntly than protocol strictly allowed, that whatever peace existed here had been built by a farmer and a dragon long before any official had taken an interest. The first formal talks between the Ashclan and Greywater Hold took place not in any meeting hall but on the ridge itself, around the worn stone cairn that had stood empty now for months, repurposed by quiet agreement as neutral ground sacred to both sides for very different reasons. Uvashi spoke for her people. Reyes, somewhat reluctantly, spoke for the colony. Daniel attended only because Rel would not settle anywhere else, and sat mostly silent through proceedings far more complicated than he had any taste for, content to let people better suited to politics handle what came next. When it was over, when the first true treaty between human settlers and Scytharn clans had been agreed upon in rough outline, Daniel walked back toward his farm in the last light of evening, Rel falling into step beside him the way it always did now, too large to fit through any human doorway, but never far from wherever Daniel happened to be. He had never asked for any of this. He had buried a dying hatchling because it felt wrong to leave it alone, the same instinct that had once driven him to bury his own family with his own hands when no one else remained to do it. He had not been trying to build peace, or symbols, or treaties. He had only been trying to make sure something did not die unremembered. The cairn still stood on the ridge, weathered now but solid, no longer marking a grave but something closer to a beginning. Children from Greywater Hold sometimes climbed up to see it, and Skytharn hatchlings from nearby Ashglen settlements, once unthinkable visitors, occasionally did the same, drawn by a story that was rapidly becoming less legend and more simple, well-known history. The human who buried a dragon, the dragon who came home. On quiet evenings, Daniel could still be found out on the ridge sometimes, not tending a grave anymore but simply sitting beside Rel as the sun went down over fields that had once been ash and were now, slowly, turning green again. Neither of them needed words for it. Some things, once planted carefully enough, simply grew.